Welcome to our deep dive today. And, I think this one as a philosopher will be right up your alley. We're looking at moral arguments for the existence of God.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah. So we're going to see how some philosophers use, well, the very idea of morality to argue for a divine creator.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. It's a topic that's been around for centuries, of course.
Yeah.
Thinkers from Thomas Aquinas to Kant have weighed in on this.
hmm
And, it's something that people are still really grappling with today.
Absolutely. And I think what's so intriguing about these arguments is that they don't rely on empirical evidence or, scientific data.
Right.
They're really about values, duties,
Right.
our sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like using your moral compass to navigate the map of reality. And, these arguments, I think they still really resonate with a lot of people.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, when you think about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity,
Oh, yeah.
that's how he starts. His whole case for Christianity is with a moral argument.
That's right.
And clearly, it really hit home for a lot of readers.
hmm
But, before we get too far into the specifics, I think it's important to kind of step back and clarify how contemporary philosophers view theistic arguments in general.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, these arguments aren't typically seen as like strict proofs,
Right.
that force you to believe in God.
Right.
They're more about showing that belief in God is reasonable or maybe even offering a path to knowledge of God.
So it's less about forcing a conclusion and more about, kind of adding weight to the scales.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. Well, that raises a question then about, where does the burden of proof lie in these discussions?
Yeah.
Because some philosophers, like Antony Flew, argue for a presumption of atheism,
Right?
which basically means the default position should be disbelief until sufficient evidence for God is provided.
Right. So, his analogy is like, we don't just assume unicorns exist until we see good evidence for them.
Right.
But of course, other philosophers push back against this presumption.
Right.
Alvin Plantinga, for instance,
Oh, yeah.
argues that belief in God can be what he calls properly basic.
Okay.
So it doesn't require external evidence. It kind of arises from a natural human faculty.
So it's like this innate sense of the divine.
Exactly, a sensus divinitatis, as some call it.
Right.
And Plantinga argues that the sense of God is just as fundamental as, our senses of sight or touch.
I see.
But that doesn't settle the debate, of course.
Right.
Because, then you get into questions about, well, how reliable is that sense?
Right.
Critics would say, well, if it's fallible, then it doesn't actually get us any closer to knowledge of God.
That's a good point. I mean, but then some might say that, this whole burden of proof debate is kind of a distraction from the real issue here.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it more about understanding the fundamental character of the universe?
Yeah.
Is it ultimately a realm of purpose and meaning, or just this random collection of particles?
Yeah, that's a really insightful way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, both theism and atheism are making claims about the nature of reality.
Right.
So maybe the burden of proof shouldn't rest entirely on one side or the other.
Okay.
Maybe it's more about which view offers a more compelling explanation for our experience.
And that leads perfectly into our next point, which is looking at the history of moral arguments.
Yes.
Because we've had some, big names throughout history who have weighed in on this.
Absolutely.
Thomas Aquinas with his famous fourth way,
Right.
Immanuel Kant with his postulates of practical reason,
Yeah.
and many others.
Let's delve into some of those figures. So Thomas Aquinas, for example, he presented his fourth way as one of his 5 arguments for God's existence.
Okay.
And he observed that there are these gradations of qualities in the world, Things
True.
can be more or less good, true, noble.
So like a hierarchy of values with some things being closer to perfection than others.
Exactly. And Aquinas argued that this points towards the existence of a being that possesses these qualities in their most perfect form, a being that's like the source and standard of all goodness and truth and nobility.
So if we recognize degrees of goodness, there must be some ultimate good.
That's the essence of his argument.
I see.
Now, fast forward a few centuries, and we encounter Immanuel Kant.
Right.
Now, Kant rejected those traditional cosmological and ontological arguments for God,
Okay.
but he offered his own fascinating argument based on practical reason.
Well, Kant's always an interesting figure to grapple with. So what was his approach?
Well, he argued that to be truly moral, we have to strive for what he called the highest good,
Okay.
this state where virtue and happiness are perfectly aligned.
Okay.
But he said achieving that requires us to believe that our moral actions can actually bring it about.
So it's like he's saying that believing in God is what gives our striving that kind of cosmic significance.
It's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
For Kant, believing in God is not just an intellectual thing. It's a practical necessity for fully realizing our moral potential.
And these ideas have just continued to echo throughout philosophical thought. I mean, in more recent times, we've seen this big resurgence of interest in divine command theory, or DCT.
Absolutely.
And that plays a central role in a lot of contemporary moral arguments for God.
Yeah, DCT essentially says that moral obligations are rooted in divine commands.
Okay.
It's like seeing morality as this cosmic law with God as the ultimate lawgiver.
So if there's a universal moral law, there must be a universal lawgiver.
Right.
So how does DCT kind of work within the framework of these broader moral arguments?
Well,
because it seems like theoretical moral arguments usually start with this claim that objective moral facts exist.
right.
And then they try to show that God offers the best explanation for those facts.
That's right. So DCT fits into that framework by suggesting that the existence of objective moral facts points to a divine source.
Okay.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
Human laws are created by human authorities.
Right.
So if moral laws are kind of analogous to human laws, then they must have an author too.
And who better to be that author than God?
Exactly. But of course, DCT has its critics. Some argue that it makes morality arbitrary.
Right.
Couldn't God just command anything, even things that we consider evil?
Right. That's that classic Euthyphro dilemma.
Exactly.
Does God command things because they're good, or are things good because God commands them?
Yeah, that's the classic problem.
Yeah.
But contemporary proponents of DCT, like Robert Adams, have some pretty sophisticated responses to this.
Yeah.
Adams, for example, argues that God's commands aren't arbitrary because they stem from God's essential nature.
Okay.
So God commands what's good because God is good.
Oh, yeah.
It's not that God's commands somehow create goodness, but rather God's perfect goodness guides those commands.
So like a great artist creates beautiful art because they have this deep sense of beauty,
Yeah,
not because they just decide to call something art.
that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Adams also draws on this idea of a social theory of obligations
Okay.
to support his view. He says all obligations arise from social relationships,
Okay.
and the ultimate social relationship is our relationship with God.
Oh.
And this helps explain why moral obligations have this kind of binding force on us.
So it's not just about following rules.
Right.
It's about honoring a profound relationship.
Exactly. Now, we do need to acknowledge that not everyone buys into DCT.
Right?
There are other ways of thinking about the relationship between God and morality.
Right.
And some philosophers reject the idea of divine commands altogether.
Right. Some critics say that DCT undermines human autonomy.
Yeah.
Others raise these epistemological concerns about how can we even know God's commands?
Those are all valid concerns. And of course, there are alternative meta-ethical theories out there,
Right.
like godless normative realism, which offers a different account of objective morality without appealing to God.
Right. Godless normative realism, those who might not be familiar with the term, basically says that objective moral truths exist,
Right.
but they're not dependent on God.
Yeah. It's a complex area of debate.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, for our listener, with a background in philosophy, these debates offer so much to think about and explore.
Oh, yeah.
But I think it's time to move on to another fascinating aspect of moral arguments.
Okay.
And that's this whole question of moral knowledge.
Yes.
So let's explore how our very capacity to understand moral truths,
Right.
might actually point towards something beyond the natural world.
Absolutely. So we've been looking at arguments that focus on the content of morality. Like the idea that objective moral truths exist and that they need some kind of divine explanation.
Right.
But some arguments take a different tack. They focus on our capacity for moral knowledge.
Oh, interesting.
They suggest that the very fact that we can grasp moral truths, that we have this sense of right and wrong,
Huh.
might actually point towards something beyond the natural world.
So it's not just about morality existing,
Right.
but about us being able to know it.
Exactly.
How does that work as an argument for God, though?
Well, one prominent proponent of this kind of argument is Richard Swinburne.
Okay.
And he argues that it's incredibly improbable for moral awareness to arise in a godless universe,
Oh.
especially considering that moral beliefs aren't strictly necessary for altruistic behavior.
Right. I mean, we see plenty of examples in the animal kingdom of, cooperation, even self-sacrifice,
Right.
without any elaborate moral code.
Exactly.
It seems like they just instinctively know how to act for the good of the group.
That's right.
So are we just more evolved in that sense?
Well, it's interesting because humans do seem to have this deeper level of moral awareness,
Yeah.
a sense of obligation that goes beyond mere instinct.
Hmm.
And Swinburne argues that God has good reasons to create beings with this capacity for moral knowledge.
Okay.
It allows for, genuine free will, meaningful relationships, and ultimately a relationship with the divine.
So God wants us to be moral agents capable of choosing good over evil,
Yes,
rather than just acting out of blind instinct.
precisely.
It makes sense.
Now, this brings up a fascinating challenge posed by the philosopher Sharon Street.
Okay.
Now, she's not arguing for theism, but she presents a dilemma for moral realists, those who believe in objective moral truths.
All right, lay it on me. What's this dilemma?
Well, she argues that evolution has undeniably shaped our moral attitudes,
Uh-huh.
but if objective moral truths exist independently of our evolved dispositions,
Right.
then it seems like an incredible stroke of luck that our beliefs just happen to align with those truths.
So we're either incredibly lucky,
Right.
or our moral beliefs are just products of evolution and not truly objective.
Exactly.
That's a tough one.
It is. And this is where some theists see an opening.
Okay.
They argue that a theistic framework where God is guiding evolution provides a more plausible explanation for how we can have reliable moral knowledge.
So it's like God fine-tuned the evolutionary process
Yeah,
to make sure that we develop these moral sensibilities that reflect the true moral order.
that's the idea.
But wouldn't some people object to that?
Well,
This whole idea of God guiding evolution?
yeah.
I mean, doesn't that contradict evolution as a random process?
I think it's important to clarify what we mean by random in this context.
Right.
When scientists talk about random mutations, they don't mean uncaused events.
Right.
They simply mean that mutations don't arise in direct response to an organism's needs.
Okay.
So a God who creates and sustains the natural world, including its laws and initial conditions,
Right.
could certainly guide the evolutionary process without violating its inherent randomness.
It's like setting up a chain reaction.
Yeah.
You might not control every individual collision, but you know the overall result
Yeah.
because you initiated the process.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about arguments from human dignity.
Okay.
These arguments start with the premise that humans have intrinsic worth, some kind of special status that demands respect.
Right. It reminds me of Kant's idea of treating humans as ends in themselves,
Yes.
never merely as means.
Right.
It's a powerful moral principle.
It is.
Yeah.
And some philosophers like Mark Linville argue that certain metaphysical positions,
Okay.
particularly some forms of naturalism, can't adequately account for human dignity.
Right.
If we're just complex biological machines,
Yeah.
where does that intrinsic worth come from?
Right. It's like saying a computer program has the same moral status as a human being.
Right.
Doesn't quite feel right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Linville argues that a theistic framework provides a much more solid foundation for human dignity.
Okay.
If we're created in the image of a supremely good God,
Yeah.
then our worth is, inherent and inviolable.
But don't some non-theistic philosophers offer alternative explanations
Oh, yeah.
for human dignity?
Yeah.
I mean, what about those who connect it to our capacity for reason?
Right. You're right. Some, like Christine Korsgaard, argue that our capacity for rational thought is what sets us apart
Okay.
and gives us moral worth.
So it's not about being made in God's image,
Right.
but about our ability to think and deliberate and make moral choices.
Exactly. But this view faces challenges too.
Okay.
Consider infants or people with severe dementia.
Right.
They may not possess full rationality,
Right.
yet most people would agree they still deserve respect and
Uh-huh.
have intrinsic worth.
Yeah.
Nicholas Wolterstorff makes this point really powerfully in his work on justice.
So if rationality alone can't fully account for human dignity,
Yeah,
then what
it's
does?
a big question.
Yeah, where do these arguments ultimately lead us?
Well, it brings us to another fascinating category of moral arguments.
Okay.
Those that focus on the practical implications of belief or disbelief in God.
The so what question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How does all of this connect to the way we actually live our lives?
Yeah. Let's explore that.
Okay.
We'll see how some philosophers like Kant argue that belief in God is not just a theoretical matter,
Right.
but a practical necessity for a truly moral life.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into these practical moral arguments. I feel like this is where things get really, existential for our listener out there.
Yeah, you're right. Practical moral arguments kind of shift the focus from, trying to definitively prove God's existence
Right.
to more like exploring what belief or disbelief in God means for our lives.
Right.
How we make choices, how we find meaning. And Perhaps the most famous example of this comes from, well, you guessed it,
I bet I can guess.
Immanuel Kant.
Immanuel Kant, of course.
Always seems to find his way into these discussions.
Always, right.
So what's his take on practical arguments for God?
Yeah.
Well, Kant famously argued that even though we can't definitively prove God's existence through, pure reason,
Okay.
morality itself kind of compels us to believe.
So it's not about like theoretical certainty,
Right.
but about what's necessary for us to actually like live a moral life.
Exactly. Kant argued that morality requires us to strive for what he called the highest good.
Okay.
This ideal state where virtue and happiness are in perfect harmony.
Right.
But to really commit to that pursuit, we need to believe that it's attainable.
Right.
And that's where belief in God comes in.
Okay, so it's like having faith that the universe will ultimately reward our moral efforts.
Yeah.
Even if we don't necessarily see justice or happiness fully realized in our own lifetimes.
Right.
Doesn't that create a little tension, though, with, Kant's emphasis on duty for duty's sake?
Well, yeah.
Like, he's famous for saying, we should act morally, even if it doesn't make us happy.
That's a great observation, and it highlights some of the complexities within Kant's own philosophy.
Right.
He's not advocating for this selfish pursuit of reward here,
Okay.
but he is recognizing this deep need of reason.
Okay.
He's talking about postulates of practical reason,
Okay.
the beliefs that are necessary for us to function as moral agents,
Okay.
to make sense of our moral striving.
So it's less about us, seeking personal gain,
Right.
and more about kind of trusting that the moral order that we're trying to uphold is grounded in something real.
Exactly. Without that grounding, Kant suggests morality can start to feel pointless, even absurd.
Right. Why bother striving for something that ultimately might be unattainable in a universe that's just indifferent to our efforts?
That's it. It's a bit of a chilling thought.
It is. And other philosophers have echoed this sentiment.
Okay.
The Stephen Lehman, for example, argues that the tension between our desire for happiness
Right.
and the often demanding requirements of morality can only really be resolved if we believe in God.
So without God, we're constantly struggling between, what we want and what we know is right.
Yeah, and that could be a heavy burden to bear.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, these practical arguments, clearly, they have their critics.
Oh, of course.
Some see it as a form of wishful thinking, right?
Right.
Believing something just because it's comforting or desirable,
Yeah.
rather than because the evidence actually compels us.
It's like saying, I really want to win the lottery, so I'm going to believe I will,
Yeah.
even though the odds are astronomically against me.
Right. I can see why some philosophers would take issue with that.
Yeah. But defenders of these practical arguments like Kant argue that they're not based on just arbitrary desires,
Okay.
but on real needs of reason.
We're not just these abstract thinkers.
Right.
We're embodied beings who have to act in the world.
Yeah.
And those actions are shaped by our beliefs, even those beliefs that we hold for, what we might call practical reasons.
So our beliefs about the universe influence how we move through it.
Right.
And sometimes those beliefs are driven by, what we need to live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
A moral life.
Exactly.
Not just by, what we can prove with absolute certainty.
And some philosophers even connect this to the idea of pragmatic encroachment,
Okay.
where the stakes involved in a belief can actually influence how much evidence we require to justify holding it.
Right. If the consequences of being wrong are really high, we might be more willing to believe something,
Yeah.
even with less evidence than we'd normally require.
It's like, when you double check that the stove is off before you leave the house,
Right.
the stakes are high enough that, even a slight doubt warrants that further investigation.
Absolutely. So while these practical arguments might not, offer these like knockdown proofs, they do highlight the existential weight of our beliefs.
Yes.
They point out that choosing to believe or disbelieve in God is not just this intellectual exercise.
Right.
It has these huge implications for how we understand ourselves, our purpose.
Our place in the cosmos.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, a deep dive into the fascinating world of moral arguments for God's existence.
It's a rich topic.
It is. I mean, we've explored everything from divine command theory to the problem of moral knowledge from historical perspectives to, contemporary debates as a philosopher. I'm sure you've got like tons of notes for your next paper.
Absolutely. And for our listener out there who I know appreciates a good philosophical challenge, I'll leave you with this thought. If morality is truly objective and the universe is ultimately indifferent to our moral striving, What does that say about the meaning and purpose of our lives? Maybe that's where faith in its various forms steps in to fill the void, or perhaps there's another answer waiting to be discovered. Keep searching, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.